It's lovely to be here again. I feel greatly honoured to be back here. It's really some years since I was. And what I thought we'd do, I was in Towers last year. I was invited to give a conference, a talk at one of the conferences. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to move on to my research. Well, before that, we're going to talk about the synchronicity of the labyrinths in connection with the crop circles. Last year, I was sent a lovely email by somebody who said that I find that gazing at pictures of crop circles brings on a very meditative state. And I love to use your book because there isn't a lot of text to distract me, and the photographs are stunning. How's that for a plug? Come and see my book afterwards. Incidentally, the stalls are situated downstairs. And as she was looking at these pictures, suddenly a word came into her mind, which was didactic. Now, this was a word she didn't know. So she went to her dictionary, and she found that didactic in the dictionary said, designed or intended to teach, intended convey instruction and information as well as pleasure and entertainment. And many, many is the time that people have asked me, what meaning do crop circles have for you? Well, I think this is on a very personal basis. I think many people might possibly have different answers. But to me, that absolutely fits the bill, because I've learned more in the past 20 years than I've ever learned earlier in my life. So they are a profound subject, and I'm sure you'll all have your different reasons why you're involved in the crop circle world. Now, to go to Towers, I was invited to this wonderful labyrinth conference, and Towers is in New Mexico. It lies 7,000 feet up beneath snow-capped mountains, and it was the most wonderful town, a small town. It was a town of literati with sculptors and poets and authors, and it was just fantastic. And one of the museums there was built by a man called Fechin. He was Nikolai Fechin, and he was a Russian artist. Admittedly, I'd never heard of him, but he was renowned in Russia in those days. And it was the days of the revolution, the Tsarist revolution. He married somebody from the Russian aristocracy, so she had to flee. He was protected due to his artistic ability. But he built his own house, and he was just one of the many, many people living in Towers. And look at the wonderful work. I'm not certain if this is working. Oh, yes, there we are. Can anybody see the pointer? I don't think it's working. Let me see if this is working. I'm going to need that in order to move on. Oh, there you are. You could. What?
Press it hard.
Press it hard. Whoops. Wait a second.
No.
Oops.
Which slide are we on?
We'll go to back again, and back, and back. Right, no.
So that's
There we are.
backwards, that's forwards, and then press the button hard.
All
and
right.
get the pointer.
There we are. Under control, maybe. But as well as being a town of literati, it was also a place where the North American Indians lived, the Pueblo Indians, and it was one of the few places, I think in America, that was a World Heritage Site. And they were wonderful people. Sadly, we'd given them the gift of drink, of alcohol, and many of them had alcoholic problems. But these were their dwellings and their adobes. And what is fascinating, that originally they didn't have any openings. They didn't have doors or didn't have windows. The only opening was in the top of the house. And they used to go up via a ladder, pull up the ladder, and then descend the same way. And the reason they did this was to ward off the attacks of the white man. Eventually, of course, they succumbed. But that's the photograph I took of one of the Pueblo North American Indians, you can see what a magnificent face he's got. And the wisdom of those people is absolutely amazing. It's a simple but profound wisdom. This is a man called Tlacatel, and he is a Toltec North American Indian. He actually comes from Mexico. He was 87 years old. He's traveled the world, he's met the Dalai Lama, and when he heard of my close connection to the Mohawks, he said he wanted to do a day with me, a workshop with me. Well, you can imagine I was profoundly honored. And the day came, and it was a wonderful day. There were well over 100 people in the audience. I perched on the edge of the stage, and he sat with his interpreter. He understands English, but I think he has difficulty conveying what he wants to say in English, so he has an interpreter. And we told stories. And we told stories all day long. I could tell stories all day long, and so could he. And he was very interesting about 2012. Many people are worried about 2012. And he said the shift started in 1947, and he wouldn't be budged from that. And I looked up on the internet to see what indeed had happened in 1947. And it was the year when an American, it was the first time somebody broke the speed of sound, an American. It was just after Hiroshima, and also it was the year of the Roswell event. But he's a lovely person. He speaks in the language of the natural world, of the streams and the mountains and the birds and the beasts, and this amazing, deep wisdom. And quantum physics aren't any problem to him because they're part of the natural world too. So it was a quite incredible experience. Then we went one evening to a specially designed labyrinth. Now, this was constructed by somebody called Akhtar, another North American Indian, and he'd constructed this on the same geometric principles as the pyramids. And there were a whole series, 1,352 little bags, paper bags full of sand, into which was placed a lighted candle. And there were 1,352. That is 8 times 8 times 13. And I can't remember the significance of it, but it did have some particular significance. And you'll see all these extraordinary lights or orbs. And nearly everybody, when they took photographs, these orbs appeared. And there's one there which is particularly vivid. And I'll show you in a second. Whoops. Oh, what's happened? Am I going wrong? Sorry, new technology.
Which slide were you on?
That one, yeah. We're going on to the next one. Very good, thank you. And as you can see, this one there, it's almost as though it has information in the cellular structure. Now, I know a lot of this can be explained in plasma physics, but some of these orbs move with an intelligence, which is way beyond what we can really understand. And when I asked Akhtar about these, he said, oh, those were the spirits of his ancestors. And we went to labyrinths all over the place. They're laid on sacred spots by a North American Indian, and their energy comes from the ground and also comes from the geometry of the actual labyrinth, and everyone has their own particular energy. This was another one, and the energy in this one was absolutely fantastic. As I was walking around, I walk around and I've got my hands sort of placed like that, and I can literally sense the energy rising up. And there was an Englishman who actually teaches at a university in America, and I said, oh, can you feel the energy? And he said, no, he didn't know how to. So I said, well, walk along like that. And he did. His hands really started to tingle. And it was rather lovely because he then gave up the energy to the universe, which I thought was a lovely way of doing it. But they all had this huge, huge energy to them. Now, labyrinths seemed to be part of my life because I remember going to this little Norman keep, Benton Castle, in Wales. And this was owned by a remarkable lady called Betty Sullivan. Now, Betty Sullivan, one of our ancestors, had been ship's boy on the Beagle with Darwin and done a lot of work with Darwin. And, in fact, she had a lot of Darwin's artifacts. And she had constructed this amazing labyrinth. She'd made it herself out of railway sleepers. She'd designed it, and she'd placed it exactly in the landscape between these lovely megalithic stones. And she said to me, why don't you go into it? And I said, well, are you coming too? No, she said she wasn't. So I went in, and I walked to the center, and all I can tell you was that I didn't feel at all well. And I came out and went back to the castle, and she looked at me. She said, oh, you do look ill. I said, well, yes, I do feel ill. And it suddenly struck me that this was lunar aspected, and that certain phases of the moon, women should not go in. It would be fine for men. And then I knew why Betty Sullivan hadn't come in with me that day. Anyhow, she told me the story of a woodcutter who'd come to do some work on the estate. And he was really in a bad mood. He was very surly and just sort of out of countenance. So she told him to go into the labyrinth. Well, what Betty told you to do, you did. So he went in, and he came out, and he started working perfectly well. Well, his wife rang through about 10 days later and said, what on earth did you do to my husband? Ever since he was in that labyrinth, he is so full of energy, I simply don't know what to do with him. So, you see, labyrinths do have an extraordinary sense of affecting people. And last year, again, wherever I went, it was almost as though I was in preparation for the Labyrinth Conference. This is Boxgrove Priory, fairly close to me in Sussex. There's not much of the priory left. It's very renovated. But there was a lovely church with the most beautiful Tudor ceiling to it. And what was there but a labyrinth? Well, I couldn't believe it. It had only been put there fairly recently. And in order to take that photograph, the friend I was with wouldn't let me stand on the font. She said that was sacrilegious. So we somehow rigged up some chairs, and I wobbled on it, and she held my legs, and I did manage to get that picture. But labyrinths are special, special things. They were used for ritual, for protection, for all sorts of things. But really, their main purpose, I think, is a spiritual purpose. And it's rather as though we're taking our journey in life. And our journey in life is full of ups and downs in our quest for seeking the Holy Grail at the end. And our life, this is the same with the labyrinth, because you start in the center, we'll go in, and you get very close to the center. And then you're thrust out again, all the way around. And again you get close to the center, and still you're close to the center. But then you get thrust out again. Wait a second, we've gone wrong. Thrust out again until eventually you do come down the center. Now that's a very simple labyrinth, but this, I think, really illustrates the proper use, maybe, of the labyrinth. And as you walk a very complicated labyrinth, you may find yourself stopping in certain places. It's as though you're having to work through something before you continue. And then I went to Wilton House with my sister, and it had been about 5 or 6 years since I was there. And what did we find? But a labyrinth. And that had been put in very, very recently. It was absolutely glorious. Not content with that, what was happening in the fields? Labyrinths. And this was the first time that we had ever had a double labyrinth. This was at Mere. It was absolutely beautiful, and that's a close-up of it. And then another labyrinth, and this was at Milk Hill. This was particularly interesting because it had a double center to it. Now, you had to, if you go in, this again took a long time to walk, but if you go in on that one, you eventually come in, and you come in on that one. You come actually in on that one, but I've gone wrong. In order to come out on and into the next labyrinth, you have to come out on the other track going, otherwise you'll come back to the beginning again. And it took a long time to walk. I was taking a group round, and I had a couple of friends who were both very overweight, and they were both very lame, suffering from arthritis and polymyalgia and things. And they were very worried that they wouldn't keep up. And I said, that doesn't matter, just come along at your own speed. Well, one of them, who was the last to come in, she'd taken ages, and she came in, she got her shooting stick with her, and she plonked herself down there. We were all sitting at that part, and we were meditating or doing whatever we wanted. And suddenly she said, you know, I feel totally light. And it was as though all the cares in the world had been lifted from her shoulders. And that is a close-up of it. Now, we're going to get on to my research, which has been evolving and developing over 20 years. This was many of you will recognize it. It was a wonderful formation at Fosbury. And it was in an amphitheatre, which was 26 acres of amphitheatre. And there have been tremendous battles there between the Romans and the Brits, and eventually the Romans, of course, won. But it was one of these extraordinary areas where instead of the Romans driving a road straight through, they actually did it around the lip of the amphitheatre. And as we were walking up, Hazel Drummond, who does a lot of work with the Asara technique, and I'll tell you a little bit more. Well, I'll tell you now. It was developed originally, like everything else is developed over the years. It was, the initial concept was in 1957 when a German, Dr. Heinrich Vold, found that he could measure energy levels at certain biopoints of the body. And then a man called Jim Clark managed to identify them, and he recorded them, and he encoded them into this particular machine. And just as we all have an electromagnetic field around us, so does everything else, birds, animals, stones, trees, viruses, bacteria, all have their own particular electromagnetic field. So if you're testing for thyroid, you go into the database on this machine, and there are well over 30,000 different frequencies. Pull up the frequency of thyroid, or whatever it is, and then that's pulsed through at 5 volts at 30 microamps, so it's very, very small, you wouldn't feel it. And Hazel Drummond is the expert on this. So she was leading the way. I was burying my bottles of water, because when I bury the bottles of water, I always bury the control samples outside, and when I collect them, they're collected last. And in that way, they never get contaminated by the energies within the circle. And so Hazel was leading the way, and she walked up this tram line, and she said her legs started to go wobbly, her knees about there. And she went straight in, and that was the area she selected, just in there. And we conducted our tests. What was interesting was that many people came, they walked around this particular formation, and it was just in that precise area that everybody felt all right. There was an amazing dowser, a friend of Jim Lyons, with whom I do so much work, called Billy Gorn, who comes from Ireland, and he douses, not the way most of us do with a pendulum or rods or hands, he douses with his eyes. And suddenly you can see his eyes sort of go into the distance. And he said to me, Lucy, there is an energy going straight up from the ground, straight up through Hazel's head, and he didn't know how far it went. So he did the 2 people either side. Yes, the energy was going straight up. 2 people either side, energy going straight up. But then further out, the energy was going up and then straight down into the ground. And it's extraordinary how many people felt really ill in the rest of that formation. Christopher Weeks, who is one of my oldest researchers, who's been with me for years, he refused to go into the center because he said he thought he'd be sucked down like a plug hole. So, I mean, he had very many strange effects. This is one of the results. Now, I'm going to read you what Hazel says because she's the expert. And she said, when she's got a group of, say, 11 people being tested for any particular disturbance, we may well see 2 or 3 maybe showing similar disturbances, but usually it will be none or maybe 1. Therefore, more than 3 becomes significant. Now, the test that she conducts, the baseline test, measures energy states in major organs and systems, and this can give an indication of which organs are out of balance and could indicate health problems. Then the comprehensive test. Thousands of test items in the computer database are tested to show whether one has been affected by viruses, bacteria, parasites, etc. Then hormonal imbalance in the endocrine system. 31 hormonal signatures are tested for imbalances. Now, there's a lot of work on endocrinology because this is absolutely vital to our well-being, emotionally and spiritually and physically, that this has to be in balance. Neurotransmitters, brainwave patterns, vertebral misalignments, meridian disturbances, electrolyte disturbances, chakra imbalances, and then finally geopathic and stress and harmful energies. And here she looks at earth fields, electromagnetic stress, mineral deposits, power lines, microwave energies, radioactive exposure, ultraviolet rays, and X-rays. So you can see it's very, very comprehensive what she is measuring. And here we have the central nervous system results. And there are 7 people showing anomalies. And you can see the blue bar is indicating the control test, the first control test, we usually conduct at Avebury Study Centre. The red bar is when we go into the circle, and the white bar is the double control test that we conduct after being in the circle. And you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people were affected whilst they were in the circle, and a couple of people afterwards, and Christopher was affected both inside and outside the circle. The norm, the reading, is 50. Now, I don't know enough about the central nervous system to even begin to tell you what that means. All I can show you is the anomalies that happened. Then we had the spleen showing up anomalies too, and the spleen is part of our lymphatic system, and it really helps boost our immune system, and it fights infections, etc. You can lose your spleen in an accident, but then you're on medication for the rest of your life and your immune system is compromised. But it just shows how wonderful the body is, because the liver takes over to a large extent. And this was the thyroid results with Hazel. Now, this is just a bit worrying because the thyroid is the slowest moving gland in the whole body. And what we are seeing happening in a matter of maybe 2 to 2.5 hours wouldn't normally happen in anything less than 3 months. And also, if you look at these results, you think, well, they're contradictory, because the thyropin is raised, whereas the thyrotropin RH and the T4 and T3 are all reduced. So after a long discussion, we realized that the thyrotropin is actually the thyroid stimulating gland, and it was almost as though it was compensating for the drop in the levels in the other 3 thyroids. And then we come on to, I think, the most exciting part, because this is the brain waves. And here we're seeing, for the first time, we're spiking in delta, which is associated, well, it's also with the unconscious mind, and it's also to do with one's psychic abilities. But the gamma was the most interesting. I didn't really know anything about gamma, what happened in gamma. They're all at different hertz per second. The delta is 0.5 to 4, theta is 4 to 8, alpha is 8 to 13, beta is 13 or 14 to 30, and then you go into the gamma, which is 30 to 70 hertz per second, and then you go into lambda and mu even higher up. But I read copious articles on the internet, and one of them said that the brain produces dopa in the gamma state. Now, this was like a sort of, as though somebody had shone a light in my eyes, and this was a real breakthrough. And here again, we're seeing that Jim had hugely increased gamma. And the reason for my excitement was due to an old friend of mine called Mary Davis, who'd led a very traumatic life. And she has had Parkinson's, still has Parkinson's. In 1996, I think when you're ill, you're willing to try anything. And she said she'd love to go into a crop circle. And I said, well, that has to be at your own risk, because sometimes the effects are not awfully nice, sometimes quite negative. But I said, I'll try and look out for one for you. So the following year, this particular one appeared at Alton Praz. It was called the Taurus Knot. And I was down there for about a week, and I went in every day, and I was absolutely fine. And I stood by the edge of the field, and I talked to people as they came out. They were absolutely fine. So I said to Mary, I think this is where maybe you should go. So she came down with a friend. Many of you have probably heard this story before. And they sat in the center for 20 minutes. And Mary stopped shaking for 24 hours. Now, when you've got Parkinson's, you can't stop shaking. And apart from that, Mary said it wasn't just the shaking, the cessation of shaking. It was the wonderful feeling of well-being that went along with this. Well, over the years, this has been the main thing that has actually kept me researching this phenomenon. What happened to Mary? There was no doubt something had. And she and I often talk, and she said, I just didn't know what had happened to me. And she said, well, you know, she'd long to know. We all long to know. And this is the section we're dealing with, the electromagnetic section, the infrared and microwave area. Well, the tests we did last year were at Barbary Castle, and you only have to look at that formation to realize what a wonderfully harmonious formation it is. The geometry is absolutely beautiful, and it's like nested crescents. And my belief is that the geometry, along with many other factors, plays a huge part in what is happening to people in the crop circles. Just as the geometry of the labyrinth is vital, and when it's put on sacred ground, they have a huge effect on us. Obviously, there are other things involved in the crop circles which are in addition, and Jim will be talking to you about that later on. I wrote up my report on the internet. I always do at the end of the year, and somebody called David Greenwood said he would love to be my guinea pig last year. He had Parkinson's. He'd had Parkinson's for about 6 or 7 years. He was unable to drive, but his wife would drive him all the way down from Nottinghamshire. So we did our tests. There you can see the circle. It was beautiful. We did our tests, again the control tests, and then we went into the circle. And there was David in the circle being tested. And I'm going to read you what he said. There is no doubt that while walking the spiral circuit and treading on the gently laid crop, my Parkinson's symptoms did disappear only to return fully on the journey home. As I approached the crop circle after walking down the track, I had the chronic pain in my lower left leg and foot and fatigue, which are the main symptoms that have manifested in me for at least 6 years now. When I entered the formation, I began to walk with the flow of the laid crop and close to the wall of the standing crop. My awareness of self soon disappears. Now, I think this is what happens to us all when we go into crop circles. We forget about ourselves. It's almost as though we're in a sacred space. I call it the cathedral effect. And it's almost as though you're in a womb. You're in a place of total security. And it may be on the, maybe you can see a main road running down below you, but the traffic and everything, it's not part of your world. You're in your own particular world inside a crop circle. And there was somebody who came up to me one time after a lecture, and she said, you know, I've been to all the lectures I could possibly go to, I've read all the books I could possibly read on the subject, but nothing prepared me for the actual personal experience of going into a circle. And then he said, my awareness of self soon disappeared, and I began to enjoy walking the laid path. When I spotted a small depression in the crop, I followed the tram line out of the main formation towards the depression. It was at that point, when I walked towards the depression, that I felt something like a blast of static electricity. It affected my face when both sides of my face felt in compression. They were sucked in. So that was the little, what we call the little grape shot circle that was alongside it. So this was, again, he had this temporary relief. So what were the results going to show? If they were in alpha or beta, then I could chuck all my research in the bin and just walk away from the phenomenon. So everything was crossed. And here we were doing the control samples, conducting the control samples afterwards. And yes, David was in gamma. He was extraordinarily in gamma before, but he was also in gamma afterwards. Now, theta, also, this was particularly lovely. Theta is a most extraordinary state. It's a state where you can link to the divine and you can have extraordinary learning experiences. It's maybe when you walk along and suddenly an amazing idea comes into your head, or you feel you're connecting with some other level of consciousness. That's when you're in the theta. It's a really marvelous state. And Jim was also spiking in gamma, and so was I. So something, again, was happening which was thrilling. So this year, we went into this one at Liddington, and we went in last Sunday. It was extremely muddy, I can tell you. I don't know if any of you have been in there, but this is where we went. It's a beautiful one. It's multi-dimensional. Triangles within triangles within triangles, and some people see it as a Merkaba. And if you look at the center, it's as though you can see it in 3D. It's a sort of tetrahedral shape, like the pyramids. Wait a second. There we are. That's a close-up. Now, this year, we've made a breakthrough. For the first time, I managed to get a mainstream scientist called Paul Gerry. Now, this brings our research onto a completely new level and a completely new footing, and brings in the mainstream science, the academia world. And Paul Gerry is a clinical physiologist. He works with the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital. He plays a vital part. He does a lot of work with epilepsy, encephalitis, and when surgeons are operating on sclerosis, which is the curvature of the spine, which unfortunately a lot of children seem to suffer from, and also encephalitis, he wires up the person being operated on so that he can monitor the spinal cord and make certain that the doctors don't get too close or do anything that might end in paralysis or anything like that. He puts on 28 electrodes, and they're glued onto the people's heads. I did sort of vaguely warn them in advance. Unfortunately, Davy Greenwood couldn't come. He rang me 2 days before we were due to do anything, saying that his wife had developed an eye infection. He couldn't come. He was absolutely distraught. So I rushed around trying to find a Parkinson's sufferer, and Jill Puttick is leader of the Parkinson's help group, and she volunteered to come along, and there she is with Paul Gerry. And there she is with Hazel. As you can see, she's all wired up. I also had somebody with essential tremor, and I had somebody with restless leg syndrome. Now, this is allied. It's actually a relation of Parkinson's, and she's also on dopamine. So she was tested too. That was a friend of mine, Anne Godden. And this was some of the results we were getting. Now, this is raw material, and of course, you actually never publish raw material. But the slightest movement, if you blinked your eyes or if you swallowed or moved your head in any way, it would show up, and you can see there's a huge difference between there, and I think maybe she blinked. Now, what Paul has to do is to get rid of all that dross, if you like, muscle movement, and then interpret the information that is left behind. And it's relatively quick taking tests, but then it's the interpretation, the comparing of the tests, and the interpretation which takes the time. So I do not have any results for you. We then went into the formation. As you can see, it was not the most brilliant of days. And we work so hard in them, but we also have a tremendous amount of fun. And there is Jill and Paul underneath an umbrella. Incidentally, I've got that umbrella in my car, and I don't know who it belongs to. Maybe it belongs to Jill. I must get in touch with her. And there we do support tests, and this is Linda Daubney, who's got essential tremor. As you can see, she's completely submerged underneath that thing. I couldn't stop laughing, and there was Jim holding the umbrella. Oh, golly. And so then we do the tests that coming out, and we conduct the double controls. I can't tell you what the mud was like. It wasn't as bad as the Glastonbury Musical Festival, but it wasn't far short of that. But it was an amazing day. And as I say, I'm awaiting the results. Hazel didn't feel at all well. We went into the formation. As we were walking up, Paul Gerry had got his a machine monitoring the electromagnetic fields. And when we went in, I always dowsed for the spot where we should do the tests. Hazel actually wanted to do them in another place, so I was happy to go along with that. Wait a second. We did the tests in, wait a second, in that section. Hazel went in, she wanted to do them at the lower part, but my pendulum said to do it at the higher part. I was very happy to do where she found, but no, she wanted to do it where I'd found. And as Paul Gerry came up the field, he said the reading on his EMF monitor was in the 30s. When he went into the formation, where Hazel was standing, it was 41, and where I dowsed, it was 46. So it was showing really quite a considerable difference between the outside of the field and the inside. Just go on a bit. Now I'm going to tell you a lovely story about a friend of mine, Christina Thistlethwaite, who had polymyalgia. And polymyalgia is a beastly condition which your body is full of aches and pains so bad that sometimes you can't get out of bed in the morning. And this wonderful one appeared at King's Somborne in Hampshire. So I planned to visit it, and I asked her to come along. And she said, oh, no, she couldn't possibly go in. She couldn't walk and everything. So I said, well, just come along for the drive. So she did. And we got there, and she went in with her walking stick, hobbled in, and Well, there were a lot of people in there, so as one always happens, one starts talking. And this is really most un-English, because sometimes men go up on trains every day of their life. They sit in the same carriage with the same people, and apart from saying good morning or grunting, they hide behind their newspapers and don't say a word and don't know anything about each other for maybe 20 years. Well, you go into a crop circle and you find yourself talking to everybody. And it's a most extraordinary thing. There's a feeling of oneness. It's rather beautiful. It is beautiful. Anyhow, we started talking. And then suddenly the clouds seemed as though the heavens were going to open. So we went back to the car, and as we got to the car, Christina suddenly said, "All my pain has gone." I said, "That's brilliant," but knowing what happens, I said, "I'm afraid this may not be permanent." Anyhow, we got home. Oh, these I want to show you. Keith Hibbage, who lives very close by, he was, I think, the first person into this formation the next day, and he took these pictures. What is significant is that this formation appeared on a night when it was raining. And if people go in with their stomping boards and everything, and you collect mud, just like we collected mud going into the Liddington one, if you go in, you bring the mud with you. And quite often I have seen a sort of smearing of mud over the crop, and that's always a bad sign. But Keith took these pictures, and I cannot see any mud on the fallen crop anywhere at all, even in the center. Well, we got home, and I dropped Christina off, and she's quite plump, and she got this, I say, this awful polymyalgia. And as she waved to me, she suddenly lifted her leg like that, and then her next leg like that. Well, that was impossible. So I went home and I had a go myself, and I thought, well, it's not all that easy. You know, I'm fit and healthy and I can do it, but somebody who's madly overweight with polymyalgia, there's not a chance. And she had to go to a funeral the next day. And when I got up the next morning, went to my car, I found she'd left her walking stick. So I dashed round, but she'd left for London. The reason was she didn't want to go to the funeral in the first place, but there was a 10-minute walk from the church to the reception. And she said there's no way she could do that. So I was really worried. And that night I rang her and I said, "I'm so sorry, I didn't get you in time to return your walking stick." Oh, she said, "That didn't matter. I was perfectly fine." And I said, "Yes, but what about the 10-minute walk?" "That was perfectly fine," she said. "Didn't bother me at all." Well, her symptoms didn't return for 92 hours. That is longer than most. And my bottles of water, I'm just going to run through this briefly. For over 20 years, I've been burying little bottles of water. You probably all know this. And I did this really against the ridicule of many of my peers. But I just felt convinced there was something special with water. In fact, I know there's something special with water. 65% of our body is water. 70% of the surface of the earth is covered in water. But there's also very much a spiritual quality to it. It has so many unusual properties. It takes longer to boil a pint of water than any other substance. And when it freezes, it expands, whereas most other substances, they actually decrease in size as they set. So there's an awful lot going on in water which we don't understand. So I originally started off by burying Volvic water, which I still do, because Dr. Cyril Smith said I had to use the most constant, and that doesn't go above 4 hertz. So I've kept doing that. Over the years, my bottles of water have been tested by scientists all over the world using different techniques, and they have shown up the most extraordinary anomalies. As with the rest of my research, which has evolved and improved using different techniques over the years, so has my water research. And the methodology is very, very strict. I bury the bottles of water. Now this is the interesting result of the water buried in the Vernon Dean Formation, the Fosbury Formation. This is using the Yara technique, which goes through the whole spectrum of the minerals. And the controls were 73 and 74. Those were the control samples. 75 was the double control, which means it never goes into anywhere near the circle, but it's the same batch of water. 76, Christopher and I didn't find, but 72, you see that gigantic spike, that was exactly where Hazel was doing her tests. Now, we had a most extraordinary result, and Jim came to the rescue here, Jim Lyons. He said the first thing to notice is the correlation between the nitrate and ammonia results. We had a huge spike in the nitrogen. Well, I know that the farmers spray nitrates on the crop, but for the difference between what is happening outside to what is happening inside is quite beyond the ordinary. The correlation between the nitrate and ammonia results. Now, there is no ammonia in a bottle of water. It seems as if there is some breakdown of water into its constituent parts, namely hydrogen and oxygen. These molecules then attach to free nitrogen atoms, creating both the increased nitrate NO3 and ammonia NH3. So whereas there's no ammonia in a bottle of water, there seems to be some complex chemical reaction between the two. Again, something which is quite out of the ordinary. And Christopher and I went back to collect the bottles, and even though he felt so ill whilst he was in the circle, what we find is that when a lot of people go into the formation, they absorb the energies, or the energies are absorbed rather like blotting paper. So 2 weeks later or so, you're absolutely fine. I bury the bottles of water, and then they are collected in no less than maybe 3 to 4 or 5 days, or maybe up to 2 weeks, dependent on the opportunity. Not less than that. And as I say, they've been tested all over the world. And here we are. We found them all apart from one. And they're wrapped, then I wrap them in tin foil. I put them in an egg box so that they don't succuss or knock together. And then they're sent off to be tested blind in a lab. And I am the only person who knows where they've been buried, which are the control tests, which are the ones inside, etc., etc. So it's a completely blind testing. And now, I want to just tell you a little bit about beware. When you go into a crop circle, don't take your credit cards and don't take your keys. Or Christopher Weeks, again, I've worked with Christopher Weeks for years and years and years, ever since we found a bird which had exploded in one of the crop circles many years ago in Surrey. And we were doing research tests in this wonderful one at Hackpen. He went to fill up with petrol afterwards, and all his credit cards had been wiped clean. He couldn't fill up. There was one person who was in one. She had her car key there, and she couldn't get into her car. And another person who came with me on a tour, I think a couple of years ago, he came from America or somewhere. And nowadays you have these sort of credit card things that you put into the lock in order to get into your room at the hotel. He couldn't get back into his room. So just be very careful what you take into a crop circle. Now, this is something which is a theory. Maybe it's a slightly wacky theory, spontaneous combustion. Over the years, many people, including me, have experienced what I call a very strange taste in my mouth when I go into certain crop circles. It's like a metallic taste, and you can't spit it out, you can't rinse it out, it is there. It's quite cloying. And I was giving a talk just outside New York many years ago, and there was a man there who was a specialist in spontaneous combustion. I'd happened to mention this metallic taste in the talk, and he said that's very curious, because one of the very few people to survived spontaneous combustion, which is very rare, had reported this metallic taste afterwards. Now, I was looking up various things on the internet, and I suddenly came across something which said Candida albicans could be responsible for spontaneous combustion. And the reason is Candida albicans is a yeast infection, and when it gets into the body, it could, and a vast amount of it, it turns into alcohol. And that alcohol then tries to escape through the bloodstream, through the pores in the body, and so you're surrounded by what might be a sort of envelopment or a cloud of fumes. And if you go near a lighted candle or you light a cigarette, you could combust. Well, this is a theory, but I'm not suggesting that when you go into crop circles, you're going to spontaneously combust. But I just thought that was interesting. Now, I'm going to show you, just run through quickly, the formations that have appeared this year. And all these photographs are for sale. The trade stands are down below. And please come to my table because everything you buy goes towards sponsoring my research. And I really think we've come to a level now of great excitement in this research, and I want to carry it forward onto a far greater in-depth and with mainstream science. That was at Uffington. The white horse is in the background, but you can't really see it because I think it was just out of the shot. This was a beautiful one at Manton. This was at Honey Street. Some people likened it to sunfishes. And this was at Golden Ball Hill. Cheryl. Now, I didn't get to it in time to photograph it, but this had the most amazing center to it. It was all raised and absolutely beautiful, like a little star. Liddington Castle. No, not Liddington Castle, Stanton St. Bernard. That was known as the cathedral. This lovely one with Silbury Hill in the background. And many people liken the pattern in there to the flower of life. It's on an unhappy farmer's land. And this one is on the A272, not far from me. It's very cubic. Not quite like an Escher cube, but very cubic. And this is Liddington, which is, I think, beautiful. It really is absolutely stunning, and the more you look at it, the deeper you can go into it. And all those different triangles, they're interlocking, intermingling triangles. And I think, Jim, you found that in the center there was a huge cone of energy, was that right? Oh, you're going to talk about this afternoon. Very good. You'll learn more. Come to Jim's talk. It's going to be amazing. And then, just in case any of you are worried about 2012, I thought maybe this might reassure you. Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here again. I feel greatly honoured to be back here. It's really some years since I was. And what I thought we'd do, I was in Towers last year. I was invited to give a conference, a talk at one of the conferences. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to move on to my research. Well, before that, we're going to talk about the synchronicity of the labyrinths in connection with the crop circles. Last year, I was sent a lovely email by somebody who said that I find that gazing at pictures of crop circles brings on a very meditative state. And I love to use your book because there isn't a lot of text to distract me, and the photographs are stunning. How's that for a plug? Come and see my book afterwards. Photograph I took of one of the Pueblo North American Indians. You can see what a magnificent face he's got. And the wisdom of those people is absolutely amazing. It's a simple but profound wisdom. This is a man called Tlacatel, and he is a Toltec North American Indian. He actually comes from Mexico. He was 87 years old. He's traveled the world, he's met the Dalai Lama, and when he heard of my close connection to the Mohawks, he said he wanted to do a day with me, a workshop with me. Well, you can imagine I was profoundly honored. And the day came, and it was a wonderful day. There were well over 100 people in the audience. I perched on the edge of the stage, and he sat with his interpreter. He understands English, but I think he has difficulty conveying what he wants to say in English, so he has an interpreter. And we told stories, and we told stories all day long. I could tell stories all day long, and so could he. And he was very interesting about 2012. Many people are worried about 2012. And he said the shift started in 1947. And he... Wait a second.
No.
Oops.
Which slide are we on?
We'll go to back again, and back, and back. Right, no.
So that's
There we are.
backwards, that's forwards, and then press the button hard.
All
and
right.
get the pointer.
There we are. Under control, maybe. But as well as being a town of literati, it was also a place where the North American Indians lived, the Pueblo Indians, and it was one of the few places, I think in America, that was a World Heritage Site. And they were wonderful people. Sadly, we'd given them the gift of drink, of alcohol, and many of them had alcoholic problems. But these were their dwellings and their adobes. And what is fascinating, that originally they didn't have any openings. They didn't have doors or didn't have windows. The only opening was in the top of the house. And they used to go up via a ladder, pull up the ladder, and then descend the same way. And the reason they did this was to ward off the attacks of the white man. Eventually, of course, they succumbed. But that's the Low-Cap Mountains, and it was the most wonderful town, a small town. It was a town of literati with sculptors and poets and authors, and it was just fantastic. And one of the museums there was built by a man called Fechin. He was Nikolai Fechin, and he was a Russian artist. Admittedly, I'd never heard of him, but he was renowned in Russia in those days. And it was the days of the revolution, the Tsarist revolution. He married somebody from the Russian aristocracy, so she had to flee. He was protected due to his artistic ability. But he built his own house, and he was just one of the many, many people living in Taos. And look at the wonderful work. I'm not certain if this is working. Oh, yes, there we are. Can anybody see the pointer? I don't think it's working. Let me see if this is working. I'm going to need that in order to move on. Oh, there you are. You could. What?
Press it hard.
Press it hard. Whoops. Incidentally, the stalls are situated downstairs. And as she was looking at these pictures, suddenly a word came into her mind, which was didactic. Now, this was a word she didn't know. So she went to her dictionary, and she found that didactic in the dictionary said, designed or intended to teach, intended convey instruction and information, as well as pleasure and entertainment. And many, many is the time that people have asked me, what meaning do crop circles have for you? Well, I think this is on a very personal basis. I think many people might possibly have different answers. But to me, that absolutely fits the bill, because I've learned more in the past 20 years than I've ever learned earlier in my life. So they are a profound subject, and I'm sure you'll all have your different reasons why you're involved in the crop circle world. Now, to go to Taurus, I was invited to this wonderful Labyrinth conference, and Taurus is in New Mexico. It lies 7,000 feet up beneath